Hi, kids. We just finished up with our uh, learning about the Chicago Beer Wars, the second part of the Chicago Beer Wars trilogy, starting with Chicago Ain't No Sunday School and the Chicago Beer Wars. And now we're going to see where the whole thing kind of culminates in a very famous event in Chicago crime history that of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, which pretty much caused the end of the Chicago Beer Wars and guaranteed that Al Capone and the South Side Gang was going to control bootlegging for the rest of Prohibition, and also that the Chicago outfit, which was what Al Capone was in charge of during this time, that they were going to be the main organized crime organization in Chicago for the next several decades. And so that's kind of all traces itself back to Valentine's Day on 1929. So let's take a look at the article. Okay, Chicago, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, the rise of Bugs Moran. After the machine gun death of Jaime Weiss in front of Holy Name Cathedral, Vincent Schemer Drucci was the next to lead the Northsiders in their battle with Al Capone's South Side Gang. Unlike most of the Northsiders, Drucci wasn't Italian like Capone. His loyalties, though, were firmly with the mostly German-Irish guys headquartered in Schofield's flower shop. Meanwhile, Capone was still largely unknown to Chicagoans. While Dean O'Banion was a celebrity gangster and John Torrio was pretty well known because he had been in Chicago since 1909, very few people knew Capone was in charge of the Southsiders. In fact, most knew him as Al Brown, the fake name he normally used. At the time, most the Southsiders were headquartered in Cicero, so they were not really even considered a Chicago gang, though they definitely were. They only operated in Cicero because the mayor and police were even more corrupt there than in Chicago, if such a thing was possible. Chicago police arrested the new leader of the Northsiders, Drucci, for nothing in particular on April 4th, 1927. As he was being put into the police car, he started trading insults with the arresting officer. The next thing anybody knew, Drucci was shot dead. The police said it was because Drucci tried to reach for a gun. Most other witnesses said the cop was tired of Drucci's back talk and plugged him with 4 shots while Drucci was in the back seat. No charges were filed, and the chief of police said the cop who killed Drucci should be given a medal. That problem is not anything new. One way or another, the Northsiders had lost another leader. Now, George Bugs Moran took charge. Moran was not really a leader like O'Banion or Weiss, but he was tough and continued the war against Capone. The American Boys. After the death of Dean O'Banion at the hands of Frankie Yale and the Murder Twins, John Scalise and Albert Anselmi back in 1924, the Northsiders would no longer allow any Italians or those who looked Italian to get close to them. They moved out of Schofield's flower shop and into a series of offices on the north side, including a simple garage at 2122 North Clark Street in the Lincoln Park neighborhood. The gang kept trucks there for hauling bootleg liquor. They expected to be safe from Capone men there. Normally, Capone's top hitman was Machine Gun Jack McGurn. Despite the Irish name, McGurn was a Sicilian born Vincenzo Garibaldi, and in his bright blue suits was highly recognizable. Everybody knew that McGurn worked for Capone. Capone was not particularly worried. He knew something that nobody else knew. He had a group of guys that he could use for just such an assignment. None were Italian, and none were from Chicago. They could move through the city without drawing attention to themselves. Those within the Capone organization were not particularly fond of them since they were outsiders and not really trusted as non-Italians. They proved their value to Capone, though, when they went to New York and murdered Frankie Yale. Yale helped out Torrio and Capone in the early 1920s by killing Big Jim Colosimo and Dean O'Banion, but lately he tried to move into Chicago bootlegging himself. Yale was killed with a deadly Tommy gun. That signaled to the rest of the country that the killers were from Chicago, the only place where the gun had been used. The orders to kill Yale came from Chicago, but the killers were from St. Louis. In that city, they were known as part of the Egan's Rats gang. When they began to work for Capone, they were nicknamed the American Boys by his Italian crew. And there you see the 6 guys who were the American Boys: Gus Winkler, Ray Nugent, Bob Carey, Fred Getz, Byron Bolton, and Fred Killer Burke. Valentine's Day. Bugs Moran suspected something was up. Capone men regularly hijacked his liquor shipments. Since O'Banion's murder, Capone was always one step ahead of the Northsiders. While they definitely taken some hits, they still controlled the best bootlegging territory in Chicago. The upscale neighborhoods of the Gold Coast, Lincoln Park, Old Town, Lakeview, Uptown, and Ravenswood. Moran still commanded a group of fierce gunmen such as the Gusenberg brothers. He knew, though, that they were losing the Chicago Beer Wars. He needed to change that in a hurry. He suspected that he might have a spy in his group. He wanted to get his top guys together to discuss how they were going to deal with that. Moran called a meeting of the Northsider leadership Thursday morning, February 14th, 1929, at the garage on Clark Street. And right there is a picture of the garage itself. The entrance was in the back. What you're looking at was kind of the office part of it in the front. Moran would be there. So would fellow Northsiders Ted Newberry, Willie Marks, Frank Foster, Adam Heyer, Al Weinshank, killers Pete and Frank Gusenberg, and James Clark. Once there, they would decide how to expose the traitor Moran believed was in the gang. The morning was bitter cold, as February usually is in Chicago. The Northsiders started arriving at around 10 in the morning, bundled up in topcoats, suits, and felt hats in the men's fashion of the day. By about 10:30, Heyer, the Gusenbergs, Clark, and Weinshank had shown up to the meeting. Also present were John May, a mechanic who was employed simply to fix the gang's trucks, and Dr. Reinhard Schwimmer, an optometrist who was not a part of the gang, but who liked to hang out with bootleggers and brag to his friends that he was connected with gangsters. May's Alsatian dog Highball was tied to the bumper of one of the trucks. And there we have the men who were in the garage at 2122 North Clark Street on Valentine's Day morning, along with Highball, the dog. As the men sipped coffee in the freezing garage and waited for Moran, two policemen who entered the garage from its rear entrance interrupted them. The Northsiders were not afraid of the Chicago police. The men calmly allowed themselves to be lined up against the wall to be searched by the cops. After playing the game, the Northsiders figured they could offer the cops a few bucks and the police would be on their way. They figured that these unfamiliar cops must not appreciate whom they were inconveniencing. Fred Killer Burke and Fred Getz, the American boys who were wearing the fake police uniforms, had no intention of accepting any money from the men in the garage. With the Northsiders lined up against the wall, one of the cops opened the building's front door. Ray Nugent and Bob Carey entered through the front office, walking past the sign in the window at 2122 North Clark that said SMC Cartage Company and blocked any view of the inside of the garage from the street. Once the four American boys were inside, they opened fire. Two were carrying Tommy guns and two had shotguns. The bodies of the Northsiders were ripped apart by dozens of machine gun slugs and shotgun blasts. The seven men crumpled along the wall, almost cut in half by the bullets, their blood running into the drain in the center of the garage. Their work done, the American boys exited through the front of the garage. The men in civilian clothes left with their hands in the air, followed by the men in police uniforms. To anyone curious about the goings-on in the garage, it seemed like a simple arrest. They piled into the police car parked on Clark Street and sped off. Gus Winkler, driver of the police car parked behind the garage that brought the cops, headed in the opposite direction. One of the residents of the apartment building next door could hear a dog mournfully howling. He went downstairs and forced open the door to the garage. The first thing he smelled was the acrid smell of gunpowder. Then he saw the men crumpled on the floor in the back. Unbelievably, Frank Gusenberg, his body riddled with bullet wounds, was still alive and crawling toward the middle of the garage. The neighbor ran from the garage and called the police. Detective Tom Loftus was the first to arrive on the scene. He knew Gusenberg and leaned down to speak to the dying man and asked, "Do you know me, Frank?" Gusenberg's eyes tried to focus. He answered, "Yes, you're Tom Loftus." "Who shot you?" asked Loftus. Gusenberg rasped, "I won't talk. Cops did it." At that moment, Loftus had no idea what Gusenberg was talking about. From murder to massacre. Bugs Moran was not in the garage. He and Willie Marks were a bit late getting there. As they walked up Clark Street, they saw what looked like a police car parked outside the garage. Not interested in dealing with any cops, the two turned down Webster Street and avoided the garage and the shooting. He would find out about it a couple hours later. Ted Newberry was also not there. A few months after the massacre, Newberry joined the Capone organization and was given a warm welcome by his new friends. At the moment the shooting was going on, Al Capone was in Miami, Florida, meeting with a Dade County prosecutor about some of his business dealings. He was 1,000 miles away, and though he would be suspected of what became known as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, he would never be proven connected to it. The war was over.